So it's great to have Dr. Burkes joining us today. I just want to give you some background to him. He was born in New York City, and after attending UCLA as an undergraduate in 1976, he received his MD degree from Tufts University in Boston. And from 1979 until retiring in 2008, he was a staff physician for Kaiser Permanente in Panorama City, California. His area of specialization is general internal medicine, and he worked in primary care, geriatrics, occupational medicine, and in the emergency room department of his medical group. He's participated in a number of peace and social justice movements of the last century. As a student activist in the 1960s, working to end the war in Vietnam. And then the following decade, as a young doctor, he served as an organizer and medical consultant to the Los Angeles Committee on Occupational Safety and Health. And that group was part of a nationwide coalition of health and legal professionals that labored to make the American workplace safer. And in the 1980s, he was a member of Physicians for the Social Responsibility, whose educational campaign focused on ending the nuclear arms race. And in the Los Angeles chapter of PSR, Dr. Burkes served as head of speaker, training, and co-produced the physicians' radio show, Prescription for Survival. And he briefly served on the National Board of Directors of PSR. And then during the Cold War, he travelled to the former Soviet Union 4 times as part of the umbrella organisation, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And this group received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 for its educational campaign to warn world citizens and governments of the growing dangers of the nuclear arms race. Now, in May of 1992, Dr. Burkes met fellow ER physician Dr. Stephen Greer. And for the next 5 years, he was closely associated with Dr. Greer's Centre for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And this research organisation studied the UFO phenomenon by directly attempting to interact with an extraterrestrial intelligence, presumably responsible for the appearance of some UFOs. On Dr. Burkes' first fieldwork session with multiple other witnesses present, he observed an anomalous nocturnal light that fulfilled his definition of a UFO. And then 3 months later, in August of 1992, Dr. Burkes was named as Los Angeles Working Group Coordinator for the CE5 initiative. He held the CE5 post till 1998. In the course of his contact work, he witnessed multiple CE5s in the US, Mexico, and England. Now, Dr. Burkes views his work in the contact movement as an extension of his past efforts to establish peace and social justice. So welcome, Dr. Burkes. It's wonderful to have you join us today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Because now you know something about me, I would like to know something about you. And in order to know a little bit more about you in terms of contact, I'd like people to show hands as to how many of you have seen a UFO that you're certain was not some prosaic phenomena like Venus or something like that. Show of hands. How many have you seen? Okay. Not too many. About half, would you say?
Could be.
Okay, just about less than half. Okay, so I asked that because having multiple sightings in the course of a lifetime is a high indicator that there's ongoing contact and communication with the intelligence behind the phenomena. However, I must add that the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters, the free group, and they surveyed 4,000 contact experiencers. And remarkably enough, about half the people who believed they were in communication with the intelligence associated with the phenomena had not had sightings. They had telepathic communication or missing time or that sort of thing. How many people in the audience have had missing time? Anyone? Just 2? Anyone else? Okay, so there's just 2. Yeah, so missing time is a pretty good indicator I've had 2 episodes of missing time. And curiously enough, the intelligence behind the phenomena staged my missing time experience as part of a series of contact events that occurred across the Western United States, where in the course of December 1993, contact activists within our PSO, within the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the CSETI network, Dr. Greer's group, we had one person had missing time in Denver in the beginning of December, and then I and my fellow contact worker, Misha, had missing time. Actually, there was 2 episodes while doing field work. And then the following night, 7 people who were part of the contact team working out of Phoenix, Arizona, had missing time. So in a 1-month period, the intelligence behind the phenomena staged a series of missing time events across the Western United States. And each event had increased numbers of people. So 1 person in Denver, 2, Los Angeles, Misha and myself, and then 7 contact workers outside of Phoenix in the desert. And they also had double missing time. So the intelligence behind the phenomenon was sending us a very clear message. Yes, we can do this. And from my research and my own experiences, as well as reviewing the literature and spending time among contactees, and for people who don't know what a contactee is, we're individuals who have the belief that we're in contact or communication with the intelligence responsible for the phenomena. Our interactions are overwhelmingly positive, in contrast to the relatively small group of people, but certainly outspoken in their experiences, and their experiences are genuine, the so-called abductees, who have a very hard time of contact. But I should point out that in the population of contact experiencers, and that's the term that's usually used to describe both contactees, people who are having positive interactions, and abductees, people who feel they've been abducted, that from the free survey, which I was a medical consultant on, of the 4,000 people, the overwhelming majority, over 80%, wanted their contacts to continue. So I think it's a mixed bag. Some people having good, bad, pleasurable, painful experiences. All my experiences have been pleasurable or neutral. The only time I got into trouble was with humans. In Mexico, when I was with Dr. Greer in 1993 at the base of Popocatépetl volcano, a large triangular shaped object, several hundred feet across, at around, it was February 1st, around 11:50 at night, came out between the volcanoes, and it signaled at us. It was enormous. It blocked out the sky. It was a very dramatic experience. The next night, we were in the same locale, and some angry Mexican farmers thought we were trespassing and were firing their shotguns at us. So the experiences that we've done, trouble we've had in field work, primarily from people, although I well accept that abductees are suffering and they deserve to be supported with counseling and that sort of thing to help them work through their negative contact experiences. We have about an hour together, right? Okay, so I'll just start you off with the beginning of how it started. It was kind of innocent. I was 41 years old, middle-class existence. My wife needed a studio remodeled, Los Angeles winter. The roof was off. The architect had left town, and the storms were coming in off the Pacific, one after another, and we were all getting wet in the one remaining room that we had as part of the remodel. So I was desperate to have a hobby. So I had no interest in UFOs prior to that. The only thing that I can remember is that when I was in medical school, I saw a movie about Betty and Barney Hill. James Earl Jones was a famous American actor from the 20th century. He, with Parsons, starred as the African-American Caucasian mixed race couple that had missing time and was written up in the book Interrupted Journey. So I remember that, but other than that, I had no interest in UFOs. I went to the local public library, and for reasons that I can only guess at, but in retrospect, I think it was probably some subtle, shall we say, subtle telepathic suggestion. I said, I don't know. I'm interesting. I need a hobby. Things are going bad at home. The rain's coming in. We're all getting wet. The remodel isn't going. What do you got on UFOs? So the librarian produced a book, Amazing Gulf Breeze Sightings. It was about a series of sightings that happened on the Pensacola coast of Florida in the late 1980s. And I was fascinated. There were pictures, actual Polaroids, that were alleged to be of, well, they were typical Gulf breeze flying saucers. Hundreds of people saw them. And Ed and Francis Walters wrote a book about their contact experiences. And I read that book and I found it fascinating. Another. After about a year, I'd read maybe a dozen or two books. And of course, the remodel was finally finished, which was a good thing, you know, because that was a very hard thing to live through. And I got enough courage to go to my first UFO meeting. I show up at UFOs Expo West, and there's a tall, bearded doctor, emergency room doctor. I was working emergency at the time. And he said, my name is Dr. Stephen Greer. And Dr. Greer said he had developed a technique to attract UFOs to secure research sites where real-time interactions can occur, like signaling with lights and other things. He didn't mention the telepathic communications. That came later for me. It was quite astounding when it did occur. And so I was fascinated. I figure, you know, this is an ER doctor. He showed these videotapes which described an encounter he had in March of '92, and they happened to occur in the very same place where the first book that I had read about UFOs occurred, Gulf Breeze. And what Dr. Greer had done was he had used his contact protocols, which involved meditation and thought projection, and 3 typical Gulf Breeze saucers, like the ones I had seen in the pictures of the amazing Gulf Breeze sightings that I'd read a year before, showed up. And he had videotape to prove it. And there were 40 witnesses present who, the following month, when I went to the other side of Florida, it was called West Palm Beach, Dr. Greer had a seminar the following month. I changed my schedule in the ER so I could get off to the Atlantic coast of Florida. And sure enough, there on the beach in June of 1992, I saw a UFO as part of the contact protocols. It wasn't anything spectacular, but it was a blue-green light that silently moved from the Atlantic over our position on the beach. It was about 90 feet up, moving about 100 miles an hour. There was a cloud cover. It couldn't have been a shooting star. It wasn't a helicopter. It wasn't a tracer round fired from a ship out at sea. It was a anomalous nocturnal light, a UFO. So I was pretty tanked up, you know. When Dr. Greer said he was looking for a working group coordinator in the Los Angeles area, I said, I think you're talking to that person right now. So I volunteered. I wasn't a meditator. That's something that came later. I took a course in TM, Transcendental Meditation. My whole family, by the way, took the course, except my teenage daughter, who was going through her steroids rage. We all were meditating. All of a sudden, except Julia, who's the sweetest person. She grew up to be a social worker and has got a child of her own. But she was very upset because when I started to meditate, I lost my taste for meat. And we all, except for her, everyone else in the family went vegetarian. And the sweet little girl, in one of her teenage tirades, said, what did she say? The sweet little girl, she said, I hope you choke on your vegetarian food and die meditating. But you know, this is hormonal. She was a teenager, but she was the only one who didn't take the program of Transcendental Meditation. And I started to meditate on a regular basis. And the team that I got to work with was like the working group from heaven. It was like the most talented, intelligent, educated people. It was not a coincidence. I believe in retrospect that the people who joined my contact team and showed up for the Dr. Greer's training in August of '92 were all selected in advance and had been guided by subtle telepathic means. Let me give you an example. On my team, there was not one medical doctor. there were three of us, and we didn't know each other except, well, the others. They were a husband and wife team, but they were in my medical group. Now, Los Angeles has got about, well, the region has got 15 million people. Two of the people who showed up for the contact team were actually in my medical group, which is a big one, the Permanente medical group. And one of them was a contactee. He had had missing time. His wife also was eventually became very interested in the phenomena. We had three physicians. We had a Harvard University graduate who had 2 master's degrees, one in film writing. His name was Alex Ayers, and he was a film writer in Hollywood. Man of letters, he had 4,000 books in his library. I couldn't believe it. And he was very advanced in meditation and esoteric knowledge. And I didn't have much of a background in any of this stuff. So I relied heavily on Alex's support. And he had telepathic communication, which actually facilitated our contact work, which I can talk about if we have time later on. There was Captain Joe Viejo, a 747 pilot for United Airlines. This was a Renaissance man. He spoke Spanish. He was born in Cuba. He came to the United States, became a pilot, and he was at the top of his game, was what's called a line captain for United, flying all over the world. He had had a sighting of a UFO 7 years prior when he was a first officer on a DC-7 jet aircraft for United. The whole crew had seen a cylindrical shaped craft. We had Preston Dennett, who was the youngest member of the team, but he was a nascent writer and investigator. He's now, in the last 25 years, since we did contacted work, has written over a dozen books on UFOs. We had Dr. Dixie Sullivan, a PhD clinical psychologist, who, when we had stress-related problems or interpersonal problems within our working group, having a trained clinical psychologist with a PhD was very helpful, and she provided very good guidance when we had some interpersonal conflicts as part of the contact work that we were doing. So it was just, and then there was Dotha. She was a senior member. She was in her 60s, but she had sailed 7 seas, and she was a skilled meditator, and she knew the stars because her wealthy family yacht had traveled all over those 7 seas. And so she knew how to navigate via the stars, and she was skilled in skywatch. So when we thought something was unusual, she would say, "No, that's a shooting star. That's an aircraft." We had several very skilled observers, like I mentioned. So this was a working group that came together. There were many others that came and went, but these people were the core. And I started the work, and I was somewhat full of myself, because here I'd gone from not knowing anything about UFOs to having a contact team, and we were having regular sightings in the Santa Susana Pass. And I'll tell you about some of them, very dramatic. And so I was invited to the Mutual UFO Network, had a study group. It was called the Los Angeles Study Group. Are you familiar with MUFON? Wave your hands if you are. You are? Okay, good. So this was a group made up of some very prominent investigators who had been in the field for 30 years. And I went to their meeting because I was a physician, and I was very excited. I wanted to share about the contact work we were doing. And I said, we're attracting UFOs. This is real-time investigations. We don't have to interview someone who may have had a sighting a month or a year or 10 years ago, whose memories may be clouded by the passage of time or may have seen by themselves. We have multiple skilled observers doing real-time investigations. I said, I was really gung-ho. I said, we're the wave of the future, something like that. And then, because I considered them, I was only 40 then, and they were mostly in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. I said, I thank you for your service, but we are going to lead and shake the pillars of ufology. And I didn't go over very popular, as you can imagine. And so I was driving home on the 405 freeway, and I got home with my wife, and I said, "Baby, Yael, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is I'm never going to be invited to the prestigious UFO study group. But the good news is I just saw a UFO." And what it was a beautiful blue-green light that appeared as I was driving south on the 405 freeway. It was about 800 feet up. It was moving against traffic. I was going south. It was coming north as if to meet me. And it had a serpentine trajectory. It was moving like this, far too slow to be an aircraft. There was no helicopter. And because of the ambient light pollution in Los Angeles basin with a marine cover overhead, when you look up at any kind of aircraft it's, in the sky, it's illuminated from the reflected city lights that hit the marine layer and bounce back off the aircraft. So I could have, if it had a silhouette, if it was a physical object that had a silhouette, I would have been able to see it. A helicopter, a small plane. It was just a blue-green light. Well, that was number one. The next thing happened was, I'll mention her name, Dr. Eve Gordon. She's the other physician. She was working, she's retired now, as am I, from the Permanente group. But she was an immunologist and an internal medicine. She had 2 degrees. Her husband, with the other working group activist, Dr. Dave Gordon, he was a private pilot. And she was not very interested in UFOs when he joined the working group early in September of 1992. But while she was driving home, a few days after my encounter, in broad daylight, she saw a metallic disc about 2 to 5 miles away, hovering over the Santa Monica Mountains. Now, because she was a skilled observer and she had attended private air shows because her husband was a private pilot and they always liked to go see air shows, she knew it was not a small aircraft. It was not a Goodyear blimp. It wasn't the planet Venus. It was broad daylight. It was a metallic disc glittering in the sun. Number 2. The third sighting happened a few days later. Dotha Wayburn, I mentioned, she's married to a very wealthy lawyer, and she had a spectacular estate on a place called the Palos Verdes Peninsula. If you know Los Angeles, Palos Verdes is a very exclusive area. It's sort of like Beverly Hills, but with a view of the Pacific Ocean, which is even better. And she was driving, she just attended a meditation class, which is interesting because we use meditation in our work, and contact work. And she had just left her class and she's driving up this long driveway, several hundred feet long, to her house, perched on a beautiful cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And she sees a strange white light above her house. And she's thinking, what's that? I've never seen a light above my house. And as she's having this thought, the light comes down towards her. And as it approaches, she sees it's a 30-foot globe, mother of pearl. And she gets a telepathic message at the level of knowledge. And the message was, you were looking for us, because she'd been doing contact work with us. Not the voice, but at the level of knowledge, the message was, you were looking for us. Well, here we are. So the intelligence behind the phenomena not only staged sightings for us in the Santa Susana Pass, which is a very interesting area, and maybe I should say a few words about it. It's a high security area, and you'll understand why in a moment. But not only was the UFOs showing up in terms of golden globes, red orbs, and other things in the Santa Susana Pass, but they were able to identify people within our team in a highly congruent fashion, staged sightings for us to acknowledge that not only did they know we were doing contact, but they knew who we were, and they could contact us anytime, any place they chose. And they chose to do it in a way that was not very frightening. We were all driving home in our own vehicles. In fact, which was interesting was we were all headed south when the sightings occurred. So these were not accidents. These were staged events. So I was pretty tanked up, as you could imagine. I wasn't going to be invited to the prestigious UFO study group anymore, but I had a great contact team. I believed we were making progress. But there were some issues. We had been led, I think, by consciousness, by subtle telepathic means, to set up our research site in a place called the Santa Susana Pass. It's about 3 miles from a place called Santa Susana Research Lab. during the Cold War, that facility that was about 3 miles from where we did contact work, and you could actually look down upon it when we climbed up to the highest parts of our research site. They had developed the rocket engines for Star Wars technology. They had developed the rocket engines for the space shuttle program. And they were, Star Wars was a program started by the Reagan administration in the 80s to ostensibly shoot down nuclear missiles, but the same technology was used to probably target UFOs. And this facility was a high security place. In fact, when I was an activist within the physicians movement, as part of our work in Los Angeles, we had done a photography show to raise money for our doctors group. And it was called Atomic Los Angeles. And we had photographs of all the different atomic facilities around the Los Angeles area. Nike missile sites that were used to shoot down any Russian bombers in the 50s. Well, we had a map from the Soviet Union after the Cold War. They had released this map. It was a strategic planning map for the Kremlin, and it showed all the places that the Kremlin would drop nuclear bombs on in case of nuclear war. One of them in Cyrillic I knew Russian because I had studied at college, and it said Santa Susana Pass Laboratory in Russian. So the place that we were working on was of high security, maybe not as high as Area 51, but it was targeted by the Russians in case of nuclear war. So as soon as we got there, we started having unusual people showing up in the vicinity of our research site. There were intelligence officers from the local base who were monitoring our activities. And I can, if there's time later on, I can get into the details of Dr. Greer's mission, how he was recruited not only by the American intelligence, but also by UFO intelligence. So Dr. Greer has a very unusual career. I worked with him closely in the 90s, but for political and personal reasons, we broke in 1998. I haven't spoken to him or communicated with him since, but I follow his work closely through people who are still part of his network. And, you know, I understand the nature of his work perhaps better than most because I was in the inner sanctum of the organization when it first got started in the 90s. So we had missing time experience, I mentioned to you. We had telepathic communication. This is something that we had been alerted to. All our members were encouraged to do regular meditation practice to facilitate telepathic communication. I was with my team in 1993 in October, and we had a new person on the team. Now, this is a proviso that I think may apply to you, it may not. But if you want to have UFO sightings, you should always remember what Willie Sutton said. Willie Sutton said, he was a bank robber from the 1930s, and he was always breaking out of jail, and he'd be interviewed by the crime magazines, and they'd say to Willie, "Willie, why do you rob banks all the time?" His answer was, "That's where the money is." So if you want to have UFO sightings, it's very good to have a high-powered contactee that serves like a kind of magnet for the phenomena. So Dr. Greer was just during his early years, less so recently, but during the early years, he was a kind of UFO magnet. He was getting telepathic downloads all the time. And by hanging out with him, I had many bona fide sightings. But a year into my contact work at the Los Angeles Working Group, a Russian immigrant shows up. I'll call him Misha Goldstein. That's not his real name. Misha was a young EKG tech who had just arrived from the former Soviet Union in 1991. He got a job as an EKG tech in my hospital because he'd been trained as a nurse in Russia. He came to work in the emergency room in 1991, 92, and he claimed that he recognized me from a dream that he supposedly had while he was in Belarus, which is White Russia. He claimed that in this precognitive dream, when he was in Russia, he imagined that he would be traveling to America, he would get a job in a healthcare setting, and he would do contact work with a tall, bearded, he was used to be blonde back then, not so much gray, a doctor who was also Jewish, and he was Jewish. And when he got to a job in the ER, and he looked at me while he was doing his EKG work, he said, I was the doctor from that dream. So it was suggestive of, if he was not making the story up, that this was set up in advance. But he didn't reveal his identity for the first year of our contact team. After I had been well-trained and well-experienced, he then presented me with his отношения, his Russian word for credentials. And he said he was a high-level contactee, and he wanted to do contact work with us. So I said, sure, great, why not? And the first night he went out with us into the field, while I was meditating, I had what's called a contact download. At the level of knowledge, I perceived a UFO moving towards us while I was meditating. It was like watching a grainy movie, a black and white movie, but it had like a grill over it. And I saw a disc, and at the level of knowledge, I could see that the disc had a crew, small gray beings, but that they were in communication with a very large cylindrical shaped craft, was about 100 or 200 miles out into space. And the crew, which I could actually see running around their craft, and it was quite like watching a movie, it was very detailed. I realized that's why they call them the so-called grays insectoids, because they were moving with tremendous speed inside the craft, adjusting dials. And I got an emotional component too. These guys, whoever they were exalted. They were really excited because they're coming to see us. And there was a back and forth exchange between the cylindrical shaped craft and the flyboys on the UFO. And it was very curious the way the audio visual showed itself. I was able to look inside the craft, but what happened was the video that I was seeing in my head, the outer shell of the craft curled up like an old sardine can. When you open the can of sardines, you just curl it up. Well, the outer shell curled up, and I was able to look inside and see the crew. But the command vehicle had these guys on a short leash, and although they wanted to have a landing, or maybe even more, who knows, they were just going to do a flyby. And I was, at the level of knowledge, informed that showtime was 2 a.m. One craft was going to appear in the Northeast. When I came out of trance, I was very happy. This is the first telepathic override I ever had. I told my crew, I mean, my team out there in the field, there were 7 of us. I said, showtime is 2 a.m. One craft is going to appear in the north. I may have said northeast, I meant northwest. And because I was an ER doctor and I was working a lot of overnights, I took the prerogative of taking a nap for the first couple of hours. And the other team members did skywatch from around 11 while I was resting. I said, but you must wake me up at 10 minutes to 2. Sure enough, they did. And to our amazement, a pale, red, glowing UFO appeared in the northwest. It was at a distance of 3 to 5 miles away. It was moving at maybe 150 miles an hour, totally silent, went past us, turned to due east, and accelerated at tremendous speed, without a sound. It was moving many hundreds of miles an hour when we lost sight of it. So I was very happy about it. I went home and I said to my wife, hey, look, I'm a telepath. Now that didn't happen very often, I must admit. I did have a series of contact downloads, but only on one other occasion did I have an experience where I was given a heads up when the craft was going to appear. Not only was Misha present at that time, but also Dr. Greer was present when I had my second telepathic download that precognitively alerted me when the UFOs were showing up. The second one was in the Topanga Canyon, the Santa Monica Mountains, and the group from Fox News called the Encounters Group was doing a documentary about Dr. Greer's network, and which it was quite an interesting story. But I'll move along because there's quite a lot. Basically, I can't really squeeze 5 years of intense contact work into an hour. And at some point I will stop because I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. And so I'll go for another 15 or 20 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. And then we can stop, and that way we can finish at that would be 11:30 your time, which I think that's when our get together is over. So having Misha was like having my own little Stephen Greer here. But there were problems, and they were political, and they had to do with Dr. Greer's organization. It was basically a command type of organization. Now, command. I grew up in various left-wing causes, and I was very familiar with group process, but they were always collaborative efforts. As an emergency room doctor, I may have been head of the team, but I was just one member of the team. As a working group coordinator, I always sought counsel from my coworkers, many of them who were far more experienced than I was. When I was an activist in the peace and social justice causes, we had grassroots organizations, we had detailed discussions, we had to come to a consensus, and only then, once united, we were able to make either organizing a strike when it was the Vietnam War, and we'd organize strikes against the war, or when I was in the trade union movement as supporting trade unions, whether we were going to do a health hazard evaluation. Everything was discussed in advance. Everything was democratic. You may have had a leader, but that leader led by consensus. And I had a good team, and I had their respect, and I valued them greatly. When it came to Dr. Greer, however, his approach was more command. What is a command organization? It's like the military. You got the general, you got the general staff, you got the lieutenants, you got the sergeants, top down, or like a corporation. And so Dr. Greer's approach was pretty much top down. And although he didn't take a great interest in the working group operations, which I appreciated because I didn't want any interference. If I had any trouble and I couldn't figure things out, his assistant, Sherry Adamak, who was very supportive of our efforts, she would give me practical advice. So Dr. Greer was not running us. Some people say, he said he was a cult. That's not true. It had perhaps some cult-like features. It had to do with the way in which we interacted with the intelligence, but we were not a cult. And I looked at it more as a political investigative organization, and that used consciousness as a means of communication. In the process, I had a transformation of my own consciousness. I went from being an atheist to being someone who embraced prayer and meditation, but we were not engaged in religious activities as part of the working group operations. We were engaged in outreach to the intelligence behind the phenomena for what we thought were peaceful purposes. Dr. Greer used the expression, we were citizens diplomats. But in 1995, after I'd been doing the work for 3 years, I was publishing on the internet our reports under the moniker Los Angeles CSETI. Well, Dr. Greer didn't like that a bit. He said through his assistant, Sherry, who was kind of like his hatchet person when anybody had to be disciplined, Dr. Greer didn't do it, it was Sherry who did the dirty work. She said, no, that's no longer good. You can't use CSETI. There's only one CSETI. It's Dr. Greer in Asheville, North Carolina. If you have a report that you want to issue, you submit it to us, and we may or may not put it out on the internet. Well, I wouldn't have nothing of that because my concept was that the working group operations had to be democratic, grassroots. The contactees were coming out of the woodworks, wanting to do the work. And our mission was to train and empower as many local working group operations as possible in order to show our support of the larger effort, and also to show our, in terms of CSETI, but also to show our support of the extraterrestrials who seem to be reaching out and engaging us by staging these sightings and other kinds of interactions. And because I had Misha on my team, I really didn't need Stephen Greer anymore. He was like my own Stephen Greer. And he provided counsel and telepathic communication with us. So I told Sherry that if Dr. Greer insists on me submitting my reports to him and not letting me publish them if we have a major breakthrough, like a landing or, heavens forbid, an actual boarding. Back in the old days, we used to think we might actually get on board spacecraft. It turned out that we were wrong for us, but many other people that I've encountered over the years have boarded craft in full psychomotor control of their bodies. But because of the highly, shall we say, confidential nature of these individuals, I'm not going to reveal who they are. But I know that there are teams that are having landings and boardings, but not within Dr. Greer's network, at least that I know of back in the old days and from what I've learned. In any case, basically I gave the message that if you don't let me publish, I was preparing to break with Dr. Greer. Now, this is very interesting because it had to do with surveillance. So because I was really angry, I had given thousands of dollars to the organization, had gone on television and radio. When I got back from Mexico, where we had that massive sighting, I was on KMXC television. 600,000 people in Los Angeles got to see me speaking in Spanish about the encounter we had had at the volcanic zone, that large triangular-shaped craft. So I knew I was doing good work, and I wanted the opportunity to share in a free, democratic fashion. So behind the scenes, I was getting ready to break with Dr. Greer's network, which I didn't want to do, but I wouldn't be shut up. I wouldn't have my reports collecting dust in his office, waiting for him to decide whether it was worthy or not to be published on the internet. So I'm behind the scenes. I've got a name. I call, or instead of CE5, we're going to say Human Initiated Contact or Close Encounters, HICE, which is the preferred term for me for CE5. I think CE5 is a good term. And but all our communications are by telephone, email. Then Misha gets a call all the way from England that wakes his wife up in the middle of the night when he was at the hospital working as a nurse then. He graduated from being an EKG to be a registered nurse. And these people in England want to help us set up HICE. And the woman had such a heavy British accent and called in the middle of the night as if they were so stupid that they didn't know there was an 8-hour time difference. They wanted to talk to Misha. They had his home number. And Misha is very excited. He says, Joe, we're going to break with CSETI. We're going to be famous, This, we call it HICE, Human Initiated Close Encounters, And I say, what's wrong with this picture, Misha? He says, what do you mean? He says, who are these people? How did they get your number? No one in the network that I was developing on my own was communicating, sharing the information. Everything was by telephone and by email, obviously not secure channels. I told him, we are being set up. These people are contract agents. We're going to be used to divide the network, and because they want to see us fight among ourselves. The person, and so what I did was I got on the phone and I started telling everybody on the phone and the email that we don't want to break with CSETI, that we're being set up. Sure enough, the people in England never called Misha back. We were able to work out a deal where we could publish our reports on the internet with a proviso that this was not representative of national CSETI opinion or policy, and that these reports were of our own. So that gives you a little insight into some of the political and personal conflicts that led me to break my association with Stephen Greer. However, I'm very supportive of the idea of human-initiated contact, and the disclosure project that he was able to set up with his CIA and naval intelligence handlers was the disclosure project in 2001 was a very important event. It was only overshadowed by the amazing work that was done with Tom DeLonge in 2017 when they released the incredible videos from the naval encounters in 2004, and then later was the description of the pilots from 2015 and 16. So But the Disclosure Project in 2001, I had already left CSETI by that time. It still was a very important vehicle to bring forward important evidence, much of which was brought to Dr. Greer's attention by people within the executive branch of the United States government. And I got to actually meet he called him his advisor. I would call him his handler or case officer. Because it was these all were naval and CIA operatives who were infiltrating the UFO movement in order to do what Grant Cameron has called gradual acclimatization, or sort of disclosure light or soft disclosure, where they release information, they get some good information out mixed with disinformation, and it looks like it's coming from Dr. Greer or from Tom DeLonge. And before Tom DeLonge and Dr. Greer, there was a author called Bill Moore in the 80s who wrote the book on Roswell. He had a whole collection of intelligence operatives that were working with him called the Aviary. And he wrote the book, the first book on Roswell that broke open that case in 1980, Roswell. So this is sort of the background of our work. I had amazing encounters. I mentioned in Mexico, large triangle-shaped craft. I mentioned when I was in the UK, I had some wonderful encounters. I worked with a British contactee. My reports can be found on Facebook, Contact Underground, or you can see my name underneath, Joe Burkes, MD. You can also ask to be my Facebook friend. I recycle all my important documents, all my reports on a 6-month basis. I'm planning to publish an account of my work under the title of Notes from the Contact Underground, and which I'll describe all these events in greater detail.